Hello, everybody. Sorry. Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Anandi Rao. I'm a lecturer at SOAS in South Asian Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar organized by the School of Languages, Cultures, and Linguistics here at SOAS and the SOAS Library. I'd like to thank Hannah Imai for all her support in organizing this event. Um, Before we get started, a couple of announcements. One is that while the talk is going on, if you could ensure that you are on mute, that would be really helpful. And if you have any comments or questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and after the talk is finished, I will call on you to unmute and ask your question. The second thing is that it's currently monsoon season. Um, so there is a slight chance that our speaker might lose his internet for a few seconds. However, we hope that it should be a smooth transition. So please just, if it stops in the middle, don't worry. We will work hard to get it reconnected. So, without further ado, welcome to this talk on the life and work of Martin Wickramasinghe by Uditha Devapriya. I will leave our speaker to introduce himself.
Um, Thank you, Dr. Anandi and Hannah. First of all, Dr. Anandi, can you hear me? Perfect. Good evening from Sri Lanka, and good afternoon to you all at SOAS. And depending on what time zone you're in, good morning as well. Ayubowan Vanakkam. Thank you for joining this presentation. Over the next 40 minutes, I will be reflecting on one of the leading literary and cultural figures of 20th century Sri Lanka. Martin Wickramasinghe is a name that almost no Sri Lankan would have failed to hear of. In my presentation, I hope to give an outline, a brief one as it is, of the complexity of his writing, his thinking, the influences that shaped him, and how he in turn shaped the way we look at culture and art today. So, yeah, hold on. Yeah, so before getting into the presentation per se, I'd like to introduce myself a little bit. So currently, I'm a researcher and author, an international relations analyst, and a columnist and commentator. I've written books so far. The first of the books that you see before you was not written by me. It's basically a study of one of our foremost Sri Lankan artists of the 20th century, George Keat. I was the research coordinator on board that book. Since 2023, I've been engaged in writing on public figures and institutions. The second of these books, which I wrote in 2024, was on one of Sri Lanka's most iconic cultural figures, Ravindra Randeniya, a Sri Lankan actor. And the third of these books is a coffee table history on the Sri Lanka Law College, which is reputedly one of the oldest professional institutions in not just Sri Lanka, but also Asia. Well, I don't see how I can add to that introduction to myself. Basically, there's nothing more I can say about myself. So before I head on to the presentation properly, I'd like to basically outline the various stages and sections into which this presentation is divided. I will begin by reflecting on a key episode in Wickramasinghe's early life as a writer, specifically in the 1930s. Then I will go back in time to his childhood and upbringing in the southern province in Sri Lanka, what was then known as British Ceylon. Then I will delve into his experiences and impressions, the experiences and impressions that he gained when he was in Colombo, the capital of the country. in the 1910s and 1920s and how that shaped his writing career later on. This will be followed by a brief explication of his fiction and non-fiction, as well as his journalism in some of the leading newspapers of the day in the country. I will wrap all of this up by a very brief reflection on Martin Wickramasinghe not just as a public intellectual, arguably the most sought after public intellectual of his time in Sri Lanka, but also as a literary and cultural modernist. Having said that, let's delve into the presentation. So I begin in 1934. That is a very crucial year in Sri Lankan history, as well as in colonial history in general throughout the world at the time. In 1934, the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore visited or arrived in the British Crown colony of Ceylon. This was Tagore's third and final visit to the country. Among others, he was accompanied by the Bengali artist Nandalal Bose. By now, Rabindranath Tagore, as you would be well aware, had become an established literary figure. He was celebrated not just in India, but in Asia as well as the West. 21 years before his third visit to Sri Lanka, he had won the Nobel Prize for Literature for his collection of poems Geetanjali, which have been translated by the Irish poet William Butler Yeats. Between then and 1934, Tagore's stature, his reputation, had grown considerably in Sri Lanka. He had already travelled there before, twice, in 1921 and 1928. His travel, his third visit to the country, became the subject of extensive press coverage. The Dinamina, the leading Sinhala daily newspaper in Ceylon, Sinhala being one of the two indigenous languages that are spoken in Sri Lanka at present, basically reported extensively on his visit, reflecting on the lectures and exhibitions he held, the dramas he staged, the people he met, and what he told them, and basically how people reacted to his visit as well. This was a very crucial point in Sri Lankan history, contemporary colonial history. Just 3 years before, in 1931, the British government had granted universal suffrage to the country. With this act, Sri Lanka became the first colony in the British Empire to be granted universal franchise by the colonial government. Far from stemming the tide of anti-imperialism, however, this only fueled the demand for self-government and independence. Tagore's visit had a significant bearing on these developments, so much so that among the many articles written on him and his visit was an editorial in the Dinamina, which appeared on the very day that he came to Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, the 9th of May 1934. The editorial was titled Tagore and National Revival. You can see it here in its original Sinhala version. It's a very short editorial, but it reflects very succinctly on the implications of Tagore's visit to Sri Lanka. Lamenting that Sri Lankan society has become more or less sterile, the editorial observes that Tagore's visit can well spark a cultural revival in Ceylon. Applauding Rabindranath Tagore for taking Indian art and culture to the world outside, the article notes that in Sri Lanka, colonialism has managed to produce a highly imitative, if not provincial, culture. The article was written by Martin Wickramasinghe, the preeminent Sri Lankan novelist, critic, and journalist. More than a decade earlier, Wickramasinghe had been taken on board the editorial staff of the Dinamina by the Ceylonese press magnate and entrepreneur and independent activist T.R. Vijayawardena. D.R. Vijayawardena was linked to one of Sri Lanka's most important colonial elite families. A leading figure of the country's independence movement, he belonged to a multi-ethnic bourgeoisie which formed the Ceylon National Congress, an independence outfit and movement which consciously modeled itself on the Indian National Congress. By this point, Wickramasinghe had reached a critical stage in his career. 5 years earlier, he had published his sixth novel, Rohini. In 1914, he had published his first, Leela. 2 years later rather, in 1916, that is 2 years after the publication of his first novel, Wickramasinghe began writing articles to the press. In his first few essays, he revealed a breadth of knowledge on a range of subjects, including evolution, psychology, and European literature. Writing in his home mother tongue, he basically introduced many leading European thinkers and writers to audiences who communicated almost exclusively in his language. These initial few articles encouraged him not just to write, but also to become a part of Sri Lanka's burgeoning press industry. Wickramasinghe Vijayawardena's decision to hire him on board the Dinamina in the 1920s brought him back to Colombo. He had already been there in 1906. He was only a youth of 16 at the time. He had left Colombo some years before. Vijayawardena's decision brought him back to the country's capital. By the time Martin Wickramasinghe's seventh novel was published in 1944, he had been firmly established as the leading critic, novelist, and literator of 20th century Sri Lanka. In this, he remained both unique and different. Unlike many of the modernist intellectuals he counted as his contemporaries, Wickramasinghe was born to a highly rural and traditional setting. Unlike many in the Sinhala intellectual crowd who also counted him as their contemporary, he remained a fiercely independent mind, ready to question custom and tradition, to interpret and, if necessary, reinterpret them. Through his writings on the art, culture, and history of Sri Lanka, specifically of Sinhala and Buddhist society, Wickramasinghe combined his upbringing and first-hand knowledge of his culture with the knowledge that he gained from reading books on subjects like anthropology, science, literature, and politics. All this needs a lot of historical contextualization. There's nothing better to do in that sense than to get back to where he was born and how he was brought up. Lama Hevage Don Martin Wickramasinghe was born on May 29, 1890 in Koggala, a coastal village located in Sri Lanka's southern province. Koggala was located around 15 miles from Galle. Under colonial rule, Galle had gained a prominent place in the early decades of the British period. This was mainly on account of its harbour, basically its port facilities, and its commercial life. By the time of Wickramasinghe's birth in 1890, however, things had begun to change. The Colombo harbour was growing in importance, and the prestige that Galle once commanded in Sri Lanka's commercial life was beginning to slowly fade away. As you can see from these two photos, by the time of Rabindranath Tagore's third visit to Sri Lanka, the Colombo harbour had gained a preeminent place in Sri Lanka's commercial life. The world Wickramasinghe was born to had come under the sway of European colonialism for over 300 years. Steeped in Christianity and entrenched in Western values, it had become a definitive part of the British Empire. In the opening of Gamperaliya, the novel that made Wickramasinghe the preeminent literary figure of Sri Lanka, he describes Koggala. I quote, "The village of Koggala lies in a long stretch of land bounded on one side by the Indian Ocean and on the other by the Koggala Oya, a beautiful wide river. Tall coconut palms, trees and shrubs abound in every garden." It was essentially this world that became Wickramasinghe's inheritance. Speaking about Wickramasinghe's own childhood, he was the only son in a family of 8 daughters. Several members of his family served as police and minor village officials, in effect working within a network of administrators in the colonial government. In his memoirs, Upandasita, translated as From the Cradle, Wickramasinghe remembers his father, who would have been a very highly respected man in the wider scheme of a village in a colonial society, as a man of very few words. I quote, "Although he rarely spoke with me, I knew that father was strongly attached to me. He would go to the Gold Kacheri or Divisional Secretariat once or twice a week for official purposes. When he returned, he never failed to bring a handkerchief full of sweets." Reading between the lines in Wickramasinghe's memoirs, it is very clear that he had a very impressionable mind. He remembered the people he met and talked to, the people who in turn came and met his father and mother and befriended them. He remembered every nook and corner of his village, and the freedom and the agency that he would doubtless have enjoyed by virtue of being the son of so prominent a figure in a traditional Sinhala village would have given him the independence that he needed to go out and explore the world beyond his home. But then, of course, he entered his education. Initially, Martin Wickramasinghe was sent to the village teacher, the local village teacher, who taught him how to read and write. From there, he was sent to the village temple, known as the Sudarshana Ramya, which is located in Koggala, where he studied under a monk, Malalagama Koggala Dhirananda. Now, Malalagama Koggala Dhirananda happened to be a distant cousin of Wickramasinghe as well. There was a family connection. That was just as well. In a traditional village like Koggala, the temple served an important role. It was not just a place where people came and worshipped, but it was also a repository of learning, where children studied not just Sinhala, but also Pali and Sanskrit. In this task, Dhirananda Thera, who was by all accounts a highly erudite and well-educated monk, proved to be an adept teacher. From the village temple, Wickramasinghe graduated, so to speak, to 3 more schools. The first of these was called Buona Vista. Buona Vista was established by a completely different institution to the temple that he had been to. It was founded by the Anglican Church of Sri Lanka, specifically the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, or the SPG. The school was located in Rumassala, Unawatuna, which in turn was located around 10 miles from Koggala. Basically 10 miles from the area where he studied, and so on and so forth. Today, of course, Unawatuna has become a tourist hub, famous for its jungle beaches and pristine sea. In his autobiography, Upandasita, Wickramasinghe remembers walking around the area, exploring, foraging, and discovering. These would later spark an interest in him in biology, science, and evolution. From Buena Vista, Wickramasinghe proceeded to 2 more schools. Both were located in Ahangama, a village which was much closer to Koggala and in fact bordered on Koggala. The first of these was a Sinhala school and the second was an English one. At the English school, Wickramasinghe came across a totally different environment. As time went by, he found that he could not quite relate to this environment. I quote, The headmaster, who had grown in Colombo, knew nothing of the village or villagers. He did not know of their poverty. There were times when mother pawned my sister's jewellery in order to buy English books that I needed. Of course, one must realize that this was long years and decades before Sri Lanka implemented free education. Back then, schools like the one that he went to expected fees and payments which not everyone who enrolled there would be able to afford. Far from upsetting or discouraging him, however, such encounters made him more sensitive to the different cultures and worlds that Wickramasinghe came across in his village. In fact, his autobiography is full of humorous anecdotes about the social and class structures which had come up in Koggala by that time. As villagers rose up the social ladder and became more affluent, they would adopt Western names and habits. They did this mainly to increase their, or rather improve their respectability. This was at a time when adopting Western names and customs were seen as pathways to material progress. However, more often than not, they would end up being the subject of countless jokes among poorer villagers. Wickramasinghe himself noted these anecdotes and how poorer villagers saw their richer compatriots. I quote, "The villagers started giving their children these new English names. A person in our village who had educated relatives in Gaul named his son Edward Bruce. The village, for the convenience of pronunciation, turned it into Burus. Thereby Francis became Purancis, Abraham became Abraham, Gregory became Gregoris, Herman became Haramanis, and later Harua. For the benefit of our audience who may not be acquainted with the singular language, suffice it to say that these creative, renamed, basically versions of these original names, Gregoris, Harua, Abraham, were insulting. They were basically renamed because these villagers were responding to their richer compatriots in the way that they thought was natural to themselves. They saw these richer villagers trying to obtain respectability for themselves. In this rush for respectability, they ended up being the joke, the subject of jokes in the village. By now, however, Martin Wickramasinghe's family was caught in financial difficulties. His father had died when he was 8. Although his mother and father went to, or rather, although his mother's family went to extraordinary lengths, and his father's family as well, to finance his education, it was quickly draining their already meager resources. His mother would have been adamant on him continuing his education, but one thing led to another, and by 1906 it was decided that he would go to Colombo in search of employment. It was here that he began, arguably, his most formative years after his childhood. In his childhood memoirs, Lay Bare the Roots, Martin Wickramasinghe remembers the first time that he visited Colombo. At the time, he was still studying in his second school, Buena Vista. I quote, "I find it difficult to recapture and convey the rapturous reactions of a village boy on seeing Colombo for the first time. The fort shops, the jetty, the breakwater, and harbour alike captivated me. The great glass display window of a fort shop, Tate's Diamond Palace, bright with electric light, was one such sight that held me." Young Wickramasinghe was immediately fascinated by the rhythms of life that animated the city. He visited some of the more popular destinations in the region, the area. Among these was the Colombo Museum. At the turn of the 19th century, such institutions epitomized a largely transitionary age, when Sri Lanka was caught in the throes of colonialism, when it was clamoring to discover its past. It was essentially to this world that Wickramasinghe shifted in 19 1906. At the time, he was 16. Almost immediately, he was thrown into an unfamiliar environment. When he arrived, Colombo was being rocked by an outpouring of anger, hostility, and protest. A group of carters had begun a strike against municipal laws and regulations, and they had brought the city to a virtual standstill. The Sri Lankan historian Kumari Jayawardena notes this as the first occasion during which a labour dispute in Sri Lanka, or rather Ceylon, reflected the strong feeling of discontent against the government. It was essentially a sign that things were changing and could not be reversed. The Colombo that Wickramasinghe shifted to had become a stratified and contradictory society by 1906. While 1904 and 1905 had been highly prosperous years for the city and the country, the Carter strike in 1906 showed that this prosperity was riding on a fragile foundation. Events from the last few years, including an upsurge in the Indian nationalist movement, the victory of Japan over Russia in the Russo-Japan War, and the defeat of British forces in the Boer War, had revealed a deep-rooted and widespread hostility against the colonial government. In Koggala itself, Wickramasinghe remembered villagers taking the side of Boers after reading newspaper reports of the war. Naturally enough, Wickramasinghe became aware of and sensitive to the subtleties of stratification and distinction which he saw in Colombo. As he worked, travelled, and read, he became conscious of the many worlds that the city was opening him up to. The Buddhist revival, which had begun in Gaul and the southern coastal belt where he hailed from, had by now extended to Colombo. While the city was dominated by a colonial elite, an assertive and nationalist Buddhist middle class were also making themselves felt. Publications, discussions, and debates over the most crucial national issues were cropping up almost every day. Naturally enough, the most ordinary and common person began attending these discussions. It was against this backdrop that Wickramasinghe began to read as many books as he could. Lacking formal education, he made the most of what he had by subscribing to foreign magazines, attending public discussions, and learning to write. Initially, he read the writings of rationalist thinkers like Robert Ingersoll, who came to influence the course of radical politics and radical thought in 19th century South Asia, including, of course, India and Sri Lanka. Through Ingersoll, Wickramasinghe went on to discover writers like Samuel Leng, the British science writer, and Ernst Haeckel, the German zoologist. Through them, in turn, he discovered Darwin, Charles Darwin, and began thinking somewhat contemplatively and seriously about evolution, a subject that he would write on voluminously in later years. One discussion in particular that he took part in at this stage in his life was a public debate at the Young Men's Buddhist Association, or the YMBA, in Colombo in 1909. The discussion or debate revolved around a book written by the radical Sri Lankan, basically the radical journalist Aman D'Souza, who had been born in Goa, India, but had become very much a leading figure of radical politics at this stage in Sri Lanka's history. D'Souza was a relentless, one could say ruthless, critic of organized religion and theism. His book, The Credentials of Christianity, attacked missionary activity in Sri Lanka. It questioned the basis of Christianity. Coming at a time of deep religious fervor throughout Sri Lanka, the debate revealed to Wickramasinghe the face of a revival that was spreading itself throughout the country. Naturally enough, such encounters got him to think more seriously about these issues. In Colombo, Wickramasinghe sharpened his mind and began to study various subjects. In Koggala, he had studied Buddhism and Sinhala literature, immersing himself in them at a young age. He did not need to study them again in Colombo, even though he did to a certain extent, to basically update himself. By now, these subjects had become an inheritance to him, a crucial part of his upbringing. In Colombo, he concentrated on reading in English and basically improving his knowledge of the language. This does not mean that he was ignorant of the language before. Indeed, when he was studying in Buena Vista, he had studied not just English, but also picked up some proficiency in Latin. These basically achievements were to equip him with the intellectual discipline that he needed in his writing career. Lacking formal education, books became, in the words of one contemporary critic, his only way forward. In this, he shared much with other writers who were also near contemporaries at the time in other countries, like H.G. Wells. The result is that Wickramasinghe read indiscriminately on almost every subject, but also critically. It is at this point that he began giving serious thought to writing. In 1914, Martin Wickramasinghe published his first novel, Leela. In his introduction to the book, he explains what made him write it. He argues in the first few pages of his introduction that the book was more or less an attempt at capturing, through a fictional narrative, his critical views on culture, tradition, religion, and custom. In his introduction, he went so far as to quote the English utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill, specifically Mill's aphorism on the despotism of custom being a hindrance to human advancement. A little later in the introduction, he goes so far as to contend that there cannot be one philosophy indigenous to the East and another philosophy indigenous to the West. Basically, that there cannot be such divisions as far as philosophy, science, and related subjects are concerned. These comments need to be contextualized in order for us to appreciate why they were so radical for their time. By the early 20th century, the novel in Sri Lanka, among the Sinhala reading public, had become a vehicle for nationalist and anti-imperialist, and more often than not, anti-Christian sentiment in the country. In effect, it had transformed into a vehicle for religious, cultural, and political sentiments. One of the foremost writers of the day, who was more or less a near contemporary of Wickramasinghe, was Piyadasa Sirisena. Sirisena had staked his literary reputation on a series of novels which essentially divided Sri Lanka, or Sinhala society, into heroes and villains. In his rather simplistic scheme, Buddhism was presented as a religion of virtue, and Christianity as a religion of wine drinkers, meat eaters, and pleasure seekers. In his seminal work, the Sinhalese novel, the Sri Lankan critic and playwright Edirivira Sarachandra argues that the resentment of the Sinhalese-speaking middle class against the extremely anglicized or westernized mode of living of the upper classes reached its climax under Piyadasa Sirisena in his books. In other words, Sirisena was a product of his time and place, and he was responding to a rising demand for a literature which could depict Sinhalese and Buddhist people in a positive light. Wickramasinghe, of course, emerged a little while later. He was of a different opinion. He believed that while Sirisena played a vital role in the national, cultural, and specifically Buddhist revival of the 20th century, the limitations of his ideology had to be noted as well. I quote Sarachandra again, "Indeed, it appears that Leela is a veiled attack on Piyadasa Sirisena. In his first 6 novels, Leela, followed by Soma in 1922, Irangani in 1923, Sita in 1923 as well, Miringua in 1925, and Rohini in 1929, Wickramasinghe sought to transcend these ideological limitations. At the same time, he conformed to certain patterns and motives of the literature of that period, which was still heavily steeped in the Victorian era. Most of these novels delve into themes of romance, mystery, and popular historical fiction. It was during these years that he began to write to newspapers. His first article appeared in the Dinamina of the 21st of January 1916. The article is simply titled Plants and Animals. It poses an interesting question. If living beings such as animals and humans are subject to the laws of rebirth according to Buddhist philosophy, do these laws apply with equal validity to lower forms of life like plants? Wickramasinghe was very clearly thinking ahead of his time when he wrote this article, and very clearly it raised a lot of speculation and a lot of hostility among those who read it. Over the next few days, weeks and months, he predictably went back and forth, answering his critics, responding to them as rationally and scientifically as he could, explaining his views on the matter. You must realize that at this time, these ideologies, basically these topics that he was writing on, were accepted as facts of life. He was essentially questioning them in the public press. This automatically made him a public intellectual, but it also brought him into contact with a lot of people who disagreed with him. The controversy, however, did little to discourage him from writing further and end up in another controversy. Once the fires of plants and animals had died down, he again ventured into tenuous territory by trying to explain another point, another subject which had become a mystery for most Sri Lankans. Of course, at the time when people read newspapers very widely, it wasn't often that one came across such topics. The topic was essentially why people fell asleep listening to Buddhist sermons. One may think, of course, that such a topic is trivial. I mean, in today's context, one would not venture to discuss or debate such topics, but at the time, it was an interesting point to ponder, and Wickramasinghe pondered. One argument which had been put forward at the time was that those who fell asleep during Buddhist chanting ceremonies lacked the discipline which was needed to absorb, engage, and understand what was being preached. Basically, that the person falling asleep wasn't religious enough. Wickramasinghe's argument or counter to this, which again landed him in the thick of controversy, was that sleepiness or drowsiness could sweep over the most religiously minded individual, and that it had very little to do with his or her faith or level of piousness. These two article series made Wickramasinghe one of the leading contrarian thinkers of his time, if not the preeminent contrarian thinker of his time in British Ceylon. As expected, it got him into the public limelight, and the public began noticing him. It was only natural that from that point onwards, D.R. Vijayawardena would be interested in hiring him as a writer and later editor of the Dinamina. After writing Rohini in 1929, Wickramasinghe spent 15 long years before venturing into the next phase of his novel writing career. During this time, he busied himself writing on various topics and reading about various topics, writing about them to newspapers and reading about them to further update his knowledge on those subjects. His seventh novel, Gamperaliya, was published in 1944. It is often translated as The Changing Village. and at other times as uprooted. So you have both translations essentially reflecting the main theme in the novel, which is that of social change. It is often described as the first definitive realistic novel in Sinhalese literature. Gamperaliya should be seen in the backdrop or in light of the two novels that he wrote as follow-up sequels to the story. It was followed by Kaliyuga, which was published in 1957, and Yugantya, which was published in 1949. Now, the story of Gamperaliya, Kaliyuga, and Yugantya, the chronology basically, if you read the story follows that chronological order. Gamperaliya is followed by Kaliyuga, the age of Kali, and it ends with Yugantya, the end of an era. But he chose to write them in a different order. He first wrote Gamperaliya, and then he wrote the last novel in the trilogy in 1949, and then he went back and wrote Kaliyuga, which chronologically takes place between Gamperaliya and Yugantya. Quite apart from these three novels being landmarks in realistic literature in Sri Lanka, the trilogy as a whole, is often compared to Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa's great novel of the downfall of the Sicilian nobility, The Leopard. Wickramasinghe's trilogy, in a nutshell, is about the fall of the Sinhala aristocracy in the southern province and the rise of the colonial bourgeoisie. This alone sealed his reputation as the preeminent writer of fiction in Sri Lanka, realist fiction, that is. But he didn't concern himself writing fiction alone. He basically ventured into nonfiction as well. His first foray in nonfiction was in 1919, a collection of literary criticism simply called Shastriya Lekana. Shastriya Lekana is basically translated in English as basically essays on literary criticism. This was followed by other similar books and other similar collections of essays. In the 1930s and 1940s, however, he began writing in English to the press. More than a decade later, he began publishing many of these novels in book form. One of the first of these books was The Mysticism of Lawrence, which was published in 1951. In The Mysticism of Lawrence, Martin Wickramasinghe tried, through painstaking research, to locate D.H. Lawrence's work and his philosophy in what he saw as Lawrence's affinity for Tantrism, a philosophy that was very much current in India and also to a certain extent in Sri Lanka. A year later, in 1952, he published aspects of Sinhalese literature, Sinhalese culture. This was followed in 1956 by Buddhist Jataka stories and the Russian novel, and in 1964 by Buddhism and culture. His last two works of nonfiction were Buddhism and Art in 1973 and Sinhala Language and Culture in 1975. I say this because it brings us to a very important point about Wickramasinghe, which is that he never stopped writing. Sinhala Language and Culture was published in 1975, exactly or almost exactly a year before he passed away. Going through these essays, one is struck by how Wickramasinghe combined his first-hand knowledge of Sinhala culture with the knowledge that he acquired through books. He was almost certainly the first Sinhala speaking and Sinhala writing writer, so to speak, to delve into subjects like evolution, anthropology, and art history. What is important is that he tried to apply the frameworks of other scholars to his culture and society as well. One of the many seminal works of anthropological scholarship that he read at this point and later applied to his own culture and society was Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture, which was published in 1934 Of course, if you could know the similarity, it was the same year that Tagore visited Sri Lanka. In her book, Ruth Benedict had claimed that cultures in general could be divided into two broad types, basically two or three broad types, two of which were Apollonian and Dionysian, with minor variations. Benedict was not so crude as to say that cultures could be definitively divided into either of these types. Neither, for that matter, did Wickramasinghe subscribe to such a simplistic reading of her writings. However, Wickramasinghe referred to her work to claim at a later stage that Sinhala culture, with what he saw as its emphasis on restraint and basically a tendency to be more be less driven by emotion, was Apollonian. He basically compared Sinhala society to an Apollonian culture and Hindu society to a more Dionysian culture. Of course, given the fact that Benedict's own anthropological framework has come into question over the last so many decades since the publication of Patterns of Culture, and given the fact that Wickramasinghe's own thesis became somewhat criticized in later years, it's safe to say that just as he was ready to apply these methodological frameworks, we need to also contextualize his contribution and read them more critically. But what's important is that he was reading these texts at a very formative stage in his life. Indeed, one cannot talk about anthropology in early 20th century the early 20th century without talking about Malinowski. As expected, Wickramasinghe read Malinowski as well, and he read Argonauts of the Western Pacific. He later delved deeply into Bronislaw Malinowski's scholarship and tried to find the parallels between his study, Malinowski's study of the Trobriand Islanders, and what he saw as parallels with his own culture, Sinhala culture. So, as this quote very clearly would make clear, he looked into Malinowski's comments on folk poetry and folk songs and folk tales in the Western Pacific, and he saw certain stories which were very similar to some of those which he had heard growing up in Gaul and Koggala. His basically Wickramasinghe's worldview, his outlook, his perspective led him to champion and to basically write extensively on Sinhala culture. This was important because one of the things that he mentions in a lot of his writings is that Western art critics and historians were not cognizant or basically were not adequately aware of that culture. For instance, he was very generous with his praise for the likes of Stella Kramskritch and E.B. Havel, who were leading critics of the art and culture of India. But at the same time, he was very critical of what he saw as their ignorance of Sri Lankan and specifically Buddhist and Sinhala art. For instance, he questioned as to why, while delving so much into the Indian, basically Buddhist art in India, they were not so appreciative or, for that matter, aware of Buddhist art, the Buddha image in Sri Lanka, Buddhist art in Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. In his writings, Wickramasinghe painstakingly tried to distinguish between aspects of Indian culture and aspects of Sri Lankan culture, while also admitting that there were parallels between the two. In this respect, one of the topics that he wrote most about was the posture of the sitting Buddha image in Sri Lanka. Art historians would at once today recognize the uniqueness of this particular posture. But Wickramasinghe wrote about it through so many articles in the 1950s and 60s, his main intention being to show that while the Buddha image in Sri Lanka had grown to absorb influences from India, there was a certain point in its history where it survived as an independent art form on its own account. In this respect, he ended up being not just a public intellectual and a modernist, but also a contrarian thinker. This is rather important because in Sri Lanka, particularly, Martin Wickramasinghe is celebrated as a novelist and a short story writer. Though he is celebrated for his fiction, however, it's important that we realize that he wrote 13 novels. He wrote several short stories. He wrote a few plays, and he wrote a few books of poetry as well. But this is in a context where he wrote so much more in terms of essays on art and culture, anthropology, science, evolution. For better or worse, it is his reputation as a novelist which has sealed him for posterity in Sri Lanka and also the rest of the world. But we also need to be mindful of his contribution as a writer of non-fiction. Why I say this is that writing as a bilingual intellectual in Sri Lanka, he made a dual contribution. On the one hand, Wickramasinghe wrote in his mother tongue, his basically Sinhalese, on subjects that vernacular audiences at that point in Sri Lankan history were not too aware of. As I mentioned before, subjects like anthropology, art history, basically the writings of European thinkers and philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche. He wrote on almost every topic under the sun, from masks to folk tales to the Buddhist Jataka stories, to Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and the Catholic priest and mystic Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He basically delved deeply into their writings and their thinking and explained them in a way that was accessible for local audiences. At the same time, while writing on these topics for vernacular audiences, he explored aspects of his own culture in English. This in turn created a bridge between the two worlds that were very much present and were divided from each other in the Sri Lanka of the time, between an English-speaking majority and a basically an English-speaking minority rather, and a vernacular-speaking majority on the other hand. By the time Wickramasinghe began writing on these topics, it seemed as though this bridge could not be passed. But in making his contributions to the public press at this stage, he ensured that topics which were relevant to one segment of the population were accessible to the other, and vice versa. In this respect, he became, among other things, a champion of folk culture. And this is another contribution that needs to be contextualized as well. Wickramasinghe, from the time he began to write, particularly in English, began exploring the rituals, the customs, and the traditions of Sinhala society. From masks to the tales of the previous lives of the Buddha, the Jataka stories. This is an interesting and important contribution because Wickramasinghe essentially, in writing so much about folk culture, predicted the work of later Sri Lankan scholars and anthropologists like Gananath Obesekara, a name which many of you would be familiar with. Wickramasinghe's central assertion in all his writings on folk culture was that elements of folk culture like masks and rituals and initiation ceremonies helped to insulate people from violence, and that the fading away of this culture in turn laid the foundation, and this is a point that he makes very clearly in several of his essays, for the rationalization of violence. Basically, to get it straight from the horse's mouth, when he was writing about Sinhalese masks, the point that he raised was the humor and the sarcasm that is represented by some of these masks may not appeal widely to city people, by which he means educated people of the town and the city. But he basically says that these elements of folk culture are essential in trying to bring us down back to earth, in grounding us to the ways of living and the ways of seeing our world that is very much present in Sinhala folk culture. He made the same comment when he wrote on another aspect of folk culture, the famous dwarf image that is very much present in archaeological sites across Sri Lanka. This is an interesting point that he brings here. He basically says, as this quote makes it clear, that while the builders of religious monuments would have got their orders straight away from their patrons to be as austere and as religiously devoted as they could in their basically in how they constructed these monuments, they themselves, these artists, were human beings. And being human being and artists, they had their lighter moods and they had their sort of tendency to be a little, basically indulge in certain things that may not have appealed to religiously minded individuals. So what Wickramasinghe says here is that they basically channeled all this, I mean, they basically expressed these tendencies by constructing basically images like the dwarf structures and the dwarf images in which basically can be found today alongside religious monuments across Sri Lanka. So that's an interesting point. Why I say that is because you find this sentiment expressed even by Gananato Besekara. Much later on in his life, he wrote that over time, the life stories of the Buddha, known as the Jataka stories, tended to be rejected or ignored as folk tales meant for the edification of an ignorant people. Basically, educated society started seeing these folk tales as literary genres which had been invented for people of lower social standing. Both Obesekara and Wickramasinghe appreciated the fact that folk tales were much, much more than what this simplistic reading would suggest. But it also leads one to another criticism that's frequently leveled at Wickramasinghe as well as to Gananato Besekara, which is that in valorizing folk culture, Wickramasinghe, along with the likes of Ananda Kumaraswamy, who was also very much a champion of the art and culture of India and Sri Lanka, basically that these figures reimagine the past and that they imagined a rural Arcadia, a paradise and a utopia that had been lost because of modernity. This is a very, one could say, coherently argued criticism and one that has been both reinforced or rather supported and also in turn countered by other scholars. That's a debate that's immediately outside the ambit of this narrative, so I won't go into that. But suffice it to say that Wickramasinghe's champion of folk culture had its supporters as well as, in later years, its critics. Which brings me to the last section of this presentation and probably the most important. By the 1950s, Martin Wickramasinghe had been recognized as Sri Lanka's foremost man of letters, honored in Sri Lanka and abroad. He very quickly, for his time, joined a group of modernists which included the painter George Keat, the photographer Lionel Wendt, the architect Geoffrey Bawa, and the filmmaker Lester James Pearis. Now, you see all these figures, and you see Martin Wickramasinghe on the screen as well. He shared a lot with them. He was as interested in local culture as they were. He was as eloquent in English as they were. But in one vital respect, he differed from them. And I have basically, when I interviewed Lester James Pearis in 2015, This is what he had to say. I wasn't rooted in my culture. Even today, I can't speak Sinhala properly. We were actively forbidden to look into or be interested in other cultures. Going to a Buddhist funeral was out of the question. You had to pay penance if you did such a thing. The point is that this was very much a predicament which so many within Lester James Pierce's circle of cultural modernists, basically his contemporaries in that circle, faced. And it wasn't just filmmakers, it wasn't just people like Pierce, basically, who indulged in visual mediums like cinema, which faced this issue. Here's Harry Pierce, one of the foremost literary, or rather one of the foremost modernist painters of his time, much later in his life said that he wished he knew his own language as well as he did English. What a lot of good I could have done in my field of work. In her study of Geoffrey Bawa, the architect, the historian Shanti Jayawardena notes that we still have not properly understood the intellectual modernists of South Asia. Writing of the art historian Ananda Kumaraswamy, she notes that they remain, I quote, poorly understood. Now, this is relevant to Wickramasinghe because it's not just these intellectuals that we have not understood properly. What is even less properly understood are the intellectual trajectories which defined and distinguished these figures from each other. George Keat, Lionel Wendt, Lester James Pierce, and Geoffrey Bawa all inherited a westernized lifestyle and an English education. They had to delve deeply into their culture and study it through the aid of local interpreters such as Buddhist monks or art forms such as painting, which in a way helped them avoid the language and cultural gulf. What is unique about Wickramasinghe is that he did not confront this challenge. The culture he wrote on was the world he hailed from. And in this, he differed not just from all those figures which I mentioned earlier, but also from the leading art historian of his time, Ananda Kumaraswamy. In one sense, we can argue that Wickramasinghe helped us understand a culture and a society that had not been properly delved into until that point. Of course, there were so many scholars writing on Sinhala art and culture, but Wickramasinghe's upbringing and childhood, his education or the lack of formal education, helped him understand and probe into these different aspects of culture more deeply. In a sense of rootedness in one's community, which almost all his contemporaries, those whom I mentioned, basically that sense of rootedness which they lacked was very much there in Wickramasinghe from his upbringing. Or to quote the title of his memoirs, From the Cradle. Ironically, this gave him the elasticity that he needed to imbibe foreign cultural, artistic, and literary forms without marginalizing, looking down on, or sidelining his own cultural inheritance. I began this presentation with a reference to a visit that had a bearing on Wickramasinghe's own writing career. I leave you with three questions. Looking at Wickramasinghe's writings, it is very clear that he had his blind spots. It is very clear that he has his overwhelming strengths. Wickramasinghe's writings about culture, Wickramasinghe's writings about the society that he was born to, makes me wonder, that is, three things. In the context of a colonial society that is struggling to become a truly post-colonial and independent society, what constitutes indigeneity? What constitutes modernity? And basically, what constitutes tradition and progress? Indeed, as Wickramasinghe himself might have questioned at some point, what is culture and what is society? On that note, on that rather cryptic note, I thank you all for having listened to my presentation and hope that this presentation raised your awareness of Martin Wickramasinghe, not just as a Sri Lankan writer, but as a South Asian mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Udita. I really appreciate it. And I learned a lot from this presentation, and I can see a lot of claps and um, other emojis coming through. So if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat now or raise your hand, and I will take them. Yes, I see one hand. Abhay Kun, if you can unmute yourself and then ask your question, please. Okay. Um, Maybe before, um, while we wait for uh, uh, Abhay Kun to unmute, there is a question in the chat, Udita, which asks, could you speak a little more about how he understood and wrote about evolution? If you could answer that, that would be great.
Yeah, interesting question, and one which I think has a very big bearing on Wickramasinghe for sure. So basically, Wickramasinghe did not come across Charles Darwin when he was in Gaul and Koggala, but as I said, he explored jungle forests of Rumassala, and he began to get an instinctive understanding of biological forms, basically sea creatures and so on and so forth, in the same way that Charles Darwin did when he was young. So when he comes to Colombo, he immediately starts reading rationalist literature. He subscribes to, if I'm not mistaken, the title of that particular journal was the Literary Register. It was basically a publication of the Rationalist Society of the UK. So in his memoirs, he basically says he was too young to subscribe to that journal, but he realized this only later on. He came to Charles Darwin's writings partly through these rationalist figures that he read. Samuel Lang, basically Aldous Huxley, or basically you name it, he read them. Uh, Much later in life, he actually visited Charles Darwin's the museum, basically the Darwin Museum in Kent in the UK. And he raised a very interesting point there. Of course, that's outside the ambit of this narrative. He came across a copy of The Origin of Species. He came across a copy of Karl Marx's Capital, Das Kapital, which had apparently been gifted to Charles Darwin by Marx himself. These were contemporary figures. So Wickramasinghe, the point I'm trying to raise is Marx and Darwin were very much current figures when it came to radical progressive thinkers and radical progressive discussions in Colombo. So it is when he was in Colombo that he began to subscribe to these journals. He began to get a greater understanding of these authors and these thinkers. And over time, basically, he began to sometimes question these authors. I mean, he didn't accept them as face value, but like I said, he combined their frameworks. In Darwin's case, his understanding of evolution with the experiences that he had gained in Koggala. I'll basically finish my answer with one observation. So one observation he made is that street dogs, and this is something that crops up much later in his writings, street dogs basically circle around before they sit down, unlike domesticated dogs. certain domesticated dogs also that have that habit. So Wickramasinghe basically inferred very correctly that this was an inheritance, a cultural, or one could say a biological inheritance from their, one could call them ancestors, I suppose. Um, he was making a comment on evolution, and trying to he was basically bridging this gap between his childhood experiences, what he had seen, and the writers that he read in Colombo. So, to keep a long answer short, he came across Darwin because of the rationalist writers and intellectuals that he confronted and read in Colombo.
Thank you so much for that answer. I think there are two questions which we can take together. One is, where can we get access to Martin Wickramasinghe's essays? And second is, who is continuing this Wickramasinghe's fantastic work in the country today?
To answer the first of the questions, Anandi, could you repeat the first of the questions? Basically, where you could access Wickramasinghe's writings.
Yes,
Is that the first of the questions?
yes.
So, hello,
Hello,
Anandi, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Maybe
Okay,
you
so
can't
yeah,
hear
sorry,
me.
I think no, I think there was a bit of a lapse on my side. So to answer the questions, to get Martin Wickramasinghe's writings, I think quite apart from the fact that they have been translated into certain languages, a lot of these texts were written in English anyway. Some of them have been translated to English as well. You can get them in Sri Lanka bookshops, and the first question is related to the second question, because Wickramasinghe's legacy is basically being continued by his family. And you have a Martin Wickramasinghe Trust, and I think one of the audience members, I think there are several members of his family who have joined the discussion as well. The Wickramasinghe Trust is based in Colombo, it's based in Sri Lanka. They are involved in publishing I mean, basically, these books were published for the very first time many, many decades ago, but the Wickramasinghe Trust, as well as its publication arm, continue to publish his writings, I mean, most of his writings. And if I'm not mistaken, they are engaged in translating many of these originally written in Sinhala works into English as well. But I'll be happy to take basically connect you all with the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust to get basically to send off your inquiries about how to read them and how to get copies of those books. So I'll be more than happy to actually entertain those inquiries through my email.
Um, that's great. Other uh, any other questions? Okay. We have two hands, or maybe just one. Um, Tom, or Tom, if you would like to ask your question, and then, uh, 1 second.
Hi,
Yeah.
everybody, and hi, Uditha. It's really great to see you here at SOAS. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I have two questions, if you don't mind. The first one is, did Martin Wickramasinghe write on cultures or sociolinguistic groups and histories other than Sinhala and Sinhala Buddhist? And to follow up on that, the second question, maybe I can ask you both of them at the same time, is do you think his reading of Sinhala culture through Benedict's model that you were talking about, i.e. this less emotional cultural framework you mentioned, do you think that reflected his personal scientific and rationalist outlooks and preferences? And if so, is that something we need to be careful of when we're reading Martin Wickramasinghe's work?
Um, Thank you, Tom, for that. Great seeing you as well. So to answer the first question, most of his writings, if not much of his writings, are naturally on Sinhala and Buddhist culture and society. But there's also quite a bit of writings on Tamil Hindu culture. So I think that leads me to the second point that you very clearly raised in your second question, which is, basically he was writing about Tamil Hindu culture in Sri Lanka as well as in India to both bring up the parallels and the differences between that culture and the culture he came from. With regard to your second point, it's well taken and I fully agree with it. Benedict's own argument, as I made clear in my presentation, is not current. If I'm not mistaken, it's not current among anthropologists. I may be wrong, but it's not current or it's not mainstream among anthropologists today. Because if you read Patterns of Culture, throughout, from the very beginning, she emphasizes the point that these types should not be taken at face value and blindly applied to one culture or the other. There are minor variations. An Apollonian culture can have Dionysian characteristics. A Dionysian culture can have Apollonian characteristics. Wickramasinghe himself appreciates this sort of complexity, this nuance, because he very clearly says, that Hindu culture is Dionysian with Apollonian traits, rather Apollonian, or rather Dionysian with Apollonian traits thrown in, and Sinhala culture is much more Apollonian than Dionysian. Personally, as a person who reads and occasionally writes on anthropology, I think you need to take such observations with a pinch of salt. And here I need to come to another criticism that's leveled at Wickramasinghe, which is that, as I mentioned in the presentation, he idealizes, if not idolizes, Sinhala culture. This is a criticism that has been leveled against him by several scholars of repute, mostly outside Sri Lanka. And there's a counter argument to that criticism as well, which I won't delve into here. But for the purposes of answering your question, Tom, what I can say is that Wickramasinghe essentially felt that Sinhala and Buddhist culture had not been properly evaluated by scholars, because we are talking about a period in Sri Lankan history where much of the cultural writings that were being published on these societies were basically authored by people who came from very different social backgrounds. I mean, these were people who were very much part of the elite of the day, the intellectual elite of the day. No better example than Ananda Kumaraswamy. So there was this whole notion for Wickramasinghe that Buddhist art in Sri Lanka was seen as a diffusion. He uses the word diffusion of Indian art and culture. He didn't begrudge them for saying that. He very clearly says that there are parallels between these two societies. He basically praises Indian, basically cultural elites and nationalist elites as well for taking such strident stances against colonialism. But at the same time, he felt that deep down somewhere there was a layer or a kernel of a layer of, I would say, a layer which showed how basically independent Sinhala culture was of Indian culture. His whole life's work, the way I see it, was to show what that layer was to the outside world. We also, I mean, his sentiment would have been, we also were proud bearers of a, I mean, he wouldn't have used the word proud because he was fundamentally very anti-romantic in his writings. There's there's this argument that he was very nostalgic about singular society, but there's a counter argument that he was not. Again, I won't delve into those arguments. But to keep a long answer short again, I think on the one hand, we need to be very mindful about the classifications he uses in his writings. And on the other hand, we also need to be aware that while he tries to showcase Sinhala and Buddhist culture as this sort of culture which evolved but had an independent existence of its own as well, he was also very much concerned about showing how elastic Sinhala and Buddhist culture was. And in this, he again brought up a distinction with various other societies which he claimed were downright hostile to foreign influences. So, on the one hand, you have him, celebrating the autonomy or the independent existence, or I would say history of Sinhala and Buddhist culture, but at the same time, he is very appreciative and basically very acknowledging of how elastic that culture had become over the years. Unlike many chauvinists and nationalists who, tend to associate him with their movements, and this is a very critical point in my ongoing research on Wickramasinghe as well, he was very clear that we could not live by celebrating our past alone. And in that sense, he was both a contrarian and modernist.
Great answer. Thank you so much, Udita.
Thank you so much, Uditha. There are two last questions. One is one has to do with the influence of Dutch or Portuguese colonialism on Wickramasinghe's work, and then the other has to do with like language and the use of Sinhalese to talk about new theories, I guess.
Anandi, before I answer them, I
Yeah.
think you broke off a little bit with the second question from my end. Could you repeat the second question?
Sure. It's also in the chat if you want to
Okay.
read it.
Okay.
It might be easier, but I
Yeah.
guess the question is how did Wickramasinghe convey new and complex intellectual ideas in Sinhalese without having a pre-established Sinhalese linguistic vocabulary in such a new subject matter?
That's a very interesting question, and I think I'll begin there. So one of the sort of live, I would say one of his biggest interests was to actually come up with a Sinhala lexicon or a Sinhala grammar that was accessible to a vast majority of the people. In the 1950s and 1960s, when linguistic politics peaked in Sri Lanka, for reasons I won't get into because of considerations of time, basically there were calls to translate English textbooks, science textbooks into Sinhala and conversely to Tamil. Wickramasinghe was very critical of these attempts at mindlessly translating from English to Sinhala, because he felt that you needed to first be aware of how ordinary people on the ground responded to these translations. So one one specific example I can think of is the Sinhala term for vertebrates. So the Sinhala term for vertebrates that's used in school textbooks today is a highly complex term which I don't think I need to explain further, but basically it's a highly complex term that doesn't basically explain itself. I'm not a linguist, so all I can say is that when you hear that word, you don't basically understand how it can possibly be a translation of uh, vertebrate unless you dig deeply into the etymology of the word. Now, early on in the 1920s and 1910s, I mean, when he started writing on science in Sinhala, um, he coined certain words. These words are not current among school textbooks, within school textbooks today, but the word that he used for vertebrate, controversial as it may have been, was konduattakario, basically konduattakario. So what does that mean? It's a direct translation of the English phrase beings with backbones. So there's no better characteristic of vertebrates than the fact that they have a backbone. So Wickramasinghe used a word that was at once, from an advertising perspective, from a communications perspective, it makes perfect sense, because an ordinary villager hearing those words would at once know what on earth this person is talking about. But he was a big critic of the tendency, which basically became very apparent and very evident over the years, of trying to come up with the most erudite and complex translations for simple words. So to answer that question, early on in life, when he began writing on these topics, he coined several of these terms. Uh, Unfortunately or fortunately, for better or worse, these terms did not pick up with the, I would say, literary establishment, linguistic establishment of the day, so they were not adopted officially. When Sri Lanka began to, Sri Lankan governments began to translate these terms to Sinhala. But long before all that, when he started writing on these topics, he went down, basically talked with people, became more aware of how they responded to words and language, and crafted single equivalents of complex English terms which he felt could basically be understood among a broader section, by a broader section of the population. So that's the first question. Rather, the second question, the answer to the second question. The answer to the first question, Dr. Anandi, if you could just repeat it one more time before I answer it.
Sure. It's about the influence of Portuguese and Dutch colonialism on
Hmm?
his thought.
Hmm. Well, the southern coastline of Sri Lanka was, depending on how you see it, impacted or ravaged by not just British colonialism, but also Portuguese and Dutch colonialism. Many of the art forms that Wickramasinghe talked about, including masks, including initiation ceremonies and religious rituals, cultural rituals, and all that, basically they underwent a process of adaptation and synthesis with various colonial influences in the Dutch and Portuguese era. In fact, when I was talking about the third or second school, the third or fourth school that Wickramasinghe went to in Ahangama, I used in that particular slide an image of a temple from the region of Ahangama. If you look at that particular temple structure, you will notice a lot of Dutch and Portuguese influence. There is a temple in Gaul, not far from Koggala, which was consciously built and modeled on a Christian cathedral during the late Dutch or early British period. So, to answer your question, when we think of Sri Lankan contemporary history, that is after the 19th or modern history, when we think of colonial history, we think of two broad regions in the country. The first was the maritime provinces, which included the southern coastline and which was very much open to Portuguese and Dutch influence. And then, of course, you have the Candian kingdom, which resisted Portuguese and Dutch colonialism, but was very much taken over and conquered by British forces in the early 19th century. So you have these different trajectories of colonialism coming up in these two broader regions in the country. With regard to the southern coastline, it was anyway facing the sea. It was anyway along the coastline, and the Gold Harbor was very much, I mean, considered very important by almost all, I think Portuguese, Dutch, and British forces. So, because of those reasons, Portuguese and Dutch influences were very much a fact of life in the way you dressed, in the food you ate, and in the cultural rituals you took part in. And these are the cultural rituals, the customs, and the desiderata which Wickramasinghe himself became aware of and wrote of from his childhood onwards. So, to keep a long answer short, those colonial influences are very much present in Wickramasinghe's writings as well.
Thank you so much. And with that, we have reached the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank Uditha again for a very fascinating presentation, and also Hannah for the logistical arrangements. And some folks are asking whether this will be posted on YouTube, and I think that is up to Uditha to decide. So we will let you know. Thank
Yeah, but no problem. So thank you so much, Dr. Dr. Anandi and Hannah for hosting us as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah.